Lana.
Thank you very much. This talk is called When Agile, when your presenter fails. It's definitely failing. Fails? It's not. It was working a minute ago. Technology is always going to let me down. Fails. Okay, when Agile fails. Hooray. We all age. Some of us age more gracefully than others. Our documentation ages as well. And again, it's not always glamorous. Docs sometimes start out as this thing of sartorial elegance. It is late in the day, isn't it? Sartorial elegance. And then many, many years later and many, many patches later, they become tired and sad and badly in need of retirement. Sometimes the content is so out of date and so incorrect, the format so anachronistic, that all we can do is put it in the recycling bin. Not all documentation should be euthanized, though. Sometimes it just needs a facelift. The documentation suite I'm currently working on is one of these. The content is great. It's been lovingly maintained by an interested group of engineers for a really long time. Interested and interesting. The suite got a structure reorganization about 3 years ago. It got converted from DocBook XML to ASCII doc and put through a new toolchain. And they meant well, they had the best intentions, but what really happened is it wound up still badly organized, but differently. So to give you some context, the product I'm working on, it's an Agile team. They care very much about doing Agile the right way. And while I have been and still am a big advocate of Agile documentation practices, in fact, I have no doubt that at least some of you have been to one of my Agile documentation talks in the past, I was instantly faced with a dilemma with this particular documentation suite. This was a documentation suite that required really big structural changes. Those changes were going to have to be based on solid research and really good it's going to have to be based on solid research, and it's going to have to be based on best practices. So the engineering team and the larger docs team were going to need to be engaged, and they were going to need to be supportive of the changes if we were going to be able to get them through. Also, we wanted to implement some tooling and some publication changes as well. So it was really important that we had a lot of rigorous testing through the tool chain as well as the documentation to ensure we were delivering the right thing. So first of all, the first thing you want to do is do a proof of concept of some description. It's important to get the lay of the land, but it's also about building engagement with other teams. This is a word you're going to hear me say a lot today, engagement. I took, luckily at SUSE we have what we call Hack Week twice a year. And so I used my Hack Week to basically sketch out a proof of concept for our documentation. Took a week, did a really rough review of the existing content, identified the key areas that needed work, and developed a really rough idea of what the docs could look like. This was literally printing out tables of contents, highlighting them to indicate how the content didn't flow correctly and that kind of thing. So I could show someone a picture of a highlighted page and go, see where we've got green, yellow, pink, yellow, green, 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 yellow, pink. What that should be is green, yellow, pink. Make it really, really obvious what I was trying to achieve, where the problems were. So the way you need to work will need to be really structured. So you need to sort of lay out roughly how long you will need to do the work. In our case, I asked for a year. And then we tried to make that line up with some big upcoming events, which means I got pushed back to about 9 months. In our case, it was a major software release, a new version for our software, and we decided we were going to release new documentation with it. So the second thing, plan, plan, plan. And I know I kind of said that in the last slide, but I'm saying it again. Once you have engagement, you've spoken to people what you want, and people like your proof of concept, you start hearing positive noises from people in power, then you can go ahead and actually structure your project timeline. So now I knew I had 9 months. I based our project on the HACOS 5-phase model, which is a really old-fashioned model now, and when I first started tech writing, that's what I was working off. So I worked off it because I was familiar with it, for starters. But the other added bonus, of an accepted model is that you can encourage people to read the book. And I've been doing this. I've been telling people, go to Abe Books, you can get a second-hand copy really cheap. Go and have a look, read what I'm talking about. Even if you just read the first 2 pages of every chapter, you will then understand where I'm coming from. Also, even if they don't read the book, if you've recommended a book for them to read, it makes it seem totally legit. So once you have a structure for your project, set the dates and advertise them. We put them up on a wiki, and I did not stop talking about those damn dates for a good few weeks. So advertise them, make sure people know what you're talking about. I also like to make a point of doing at least one presentation to the team for each phase. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But again, it's about engagement. For every phase, every time I'm doing something new, something different, I'm starting on a new little piece of the project, I go and tell people about it all the time, because then they know, they might not remember what I was talking about, but they'll know that I'm the one who was talking about it. So they'll be able to come back to me and go, what was that thing? So again, keeps your project top of mind for your team and keeps engagement up. Third, research. And yes, I know we're still in planning. I appreciate that this is now the 3rd phase of planning. Get in contact with your readers in any way you can, but remember that your readers are not always, and sometimes not even mainly, your customers. Depending on your product, you may find that sales and support staff use your docs more than your customers do. And sometimes finding that out can be surprising. So we did a series of one-on-one interviews with sales and support staff and our consultants, and we sent a 7-question survey to a number of internal company mailing lists for internal staff to complete, but then for our sales and support staff to go and ask their customers to complete. We ended up getting something just under 30 responses by memory, which was certainly more than I expected since it was only out there for about 2 weeks. And again, I didn't approach any customers directly. I did it all indirectly through my sales and support teams. So it serves a few purposes, all this research. The one-on-one talk with the consultants, and then the secondary stuff with the surveys. One, it gives us direct feedback on our current docs. And it also lets a larger group of people know that there is someone who cares about these docs. Weeks, months, years later, when someone's looking at our documentation and going, oh, this sucks, they'll go, there was a thing on a mailing list. Who was that, right? Someone cares about these docs. Again, it's outreach and it's engagement. Someone cares about these docs. I'll go back and I'll find out who that person was, and I'll ask them a question. So on the first point, in terms of getting direct feedback, we had a lot of our suspicions confirmed about some of the pain points. That's great, because we now have data to back up the things we wanted to do anyway. On the second point, in terms of building engagement and that kind of thing, you might not get any immediate advantage, but it's that feedback loop that happens later on. All that you're really doing is saying, hello, someone cares about this thing, please remember that. So, builds engagement in the long term. User task analysis is the 4th thing. And yes, I appreciate this is the 4th stage of planning. This is technically part of research, but I also think it's absolutely important enough to break it out to its own point. Once you've completed surveys, you can identify 3 to 5 main reader types, along with the main probably 5 to 10 tasks that they're performing. Then you can create a matrix marking how frequently each user consults the documentation to perform that task. Note that what I'm saying is how frequently the user consults the documentation to do a task. We're not asking how frequently the user does that task, because that's a different question. So here's an example for you. So this is a slightly fictionalized version of my own most recent one. So our main users are sysadmins, sales and support. And our top 3 tasks we've got here, obviously this goes much longer. Our top 3 tasks are product research, planning for installation, and managing clients. Now we know that sales use our documentation to do product research a lot. Okay, that's one of their main focuses that they do. We know that support sometimes use our docs to do product research, And we know that our sysadmins really don't. Sysadmins are much more likely to be trying to manage clients using our documentation. And so we can make these assumptions because we've done our research, right? Then what we do is we do some simple math. We score a 3 for high, a 2 for medium, a 1 for low. The one with the biggest number wins. It's not to say that the things further down the matrix are not important. They are, and they will still be in the documentation. But it tells us where we need to focus and where we need to make sure our best work is. Product research scored quite highly. So we need to make sure we've got lots of concept information in there. We're talking about what the thing is, not just how it works. And then, by going back and looking what we had, our existing docs, we could tell we didn't have a lot of concepts. We had a huge amount of tasks, though. So instantly, we've found a gap, something that we need to work on. This is a really insightful and useful tool. It's also a really good thing to show your manager, to say, this is what I'm working on. And especially if you show sales and support people who are actually looking at your docs, like, oh yeah, that's right, I do that a lot. Yeah. So it's a really good conversation tool. Fifth, we're actually going to do the thing. And I've put this all into one phase, because you know what? You can break this up however you like. If it makes sense to draft and then do more drafts and then do a whole bunch of reviewing for months and months, that's fine. Do it whatever way works for you. We are breaking the Agile system. So be aware that just do whatever works within your own processes. One of the most important things in this phase, though, however you break it up, is that you need to track your work. In our case, we're moving from long files for each chapter, several hundred or even thousands of lines in some cases, to smaller files for each section. It's more of a not quite topic-based, if I can use that term. We also have 3 people in 3 different time zones working on it. So just tracking that work is a big exercise to make sure that every file gets transferred over and split up correctly, reorganized into the right place, and we're not double handling. How you do that and how you track that obviously is entirely up to you. And entirely up to the way you work and the way you work best with the rest of your team. But whatever you choose, make sure you've discussed it ahead of time, you have a plan in place before you begin. Don't just assume that a spreadsheet will be fine and then have someone else go, but maybe we should automate it. And throw you for 6 in the process. And yeah, also have a plan, always have a plan in place before you begin. The other most important thing with the plan is make sure you've got buy-in for your plan. If someone's nodding along and going, yeah, a spreadsheet will be fine, we'll just track it in a spreadsheet and a Google Doc, yeah, that'll be great, and then they dump the let's automate it on you, then you're in trouble, because you've got to write a whole lot of automation that you weren't planning for. Do the automation, that's fine, but get it in ahead of time. If you have someone come in and late in the plan, you can push back and go, oh, sorry, we discussed how we were going to do this and you signed off on it. So the final thing is to review. Review. It's the second most important thing after all the planning. It doesn't need to be a lengthy process, and it doesn't even need to be a particularly formal process, but at some point you do need an airing of grievances. Your guy who wanted to automate everything might want to have a whinge about that. So my one tip here is to ensure you focus on the problem and not on the people. Like Maya was mentioning, we're using I statements. I feel this, because that happened, whatever. Things like, don't say things like, Janet wouldn't give me the information I needed. Say things like, I found it difficult to get the information I needed. Keep the names out of it. That way you get closer to identifying the real problem. It's not about Janet, really. It's about getting the information. And, sometimes there's a process that needs to be picked up there, not a human being. Obviously, human beings can be at fault for things. Do that stuff in private. Try not to do it in your review meeting. Again, I will just refer to Maya's talk at this point. So finally, Agile versus something else. This is very clearly not an Agile process. It is, in fact, a very, very, dare I say it, waterfall process. Please don't let that put you off. The fact is, Agile has its uses. There are some types of processes that simply do not fit that model well. And it's a fact that even many software developers, I'm sure, would agree with. It's definitely true of documentation. That said, if you find you can do projects of this type within your own particular Agile model, you don't have any issues with that, go right ahead. Knock yourself out. Please see me afterwards and let me know what your secret is, because I'd love to know. Yeah. Obviously, if you can make it work, do it. If you can't, though, don't be afraid to break that Agile model. Agile isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. So a couple of tips for working outside the Agile model. First of all is outreach. I did say I would talk about outreach and engagement a lot. Absolutely do this. If you are talking to your product owner about what you're doing, and perhaps more importantly, why you're doing it like this, then hopefully you'll be on firm footing. If you can, start with your product owner or whoever serves that role within your organisation, and whoever is at the top of the food chain for you as an individual. Start with them first before you even begin. It's the very, very first step. That way you get a heads up that you're going to need to make some fundamental changes, and they will factor it into their scheduling. Secondly, track your work. So you will need to track this in some way within your Agile processes in your ecosystem. If your ecosystem uses epics, create an epic, sketch out the phases that I mentioned before as tasks or within that epic, and then depending on the length of your sprint, the amount of time you have scheduled for each phase of the project, you might even need to have an epic for each phase, and then have an epic of epics. It really depends on your own Agile ecosystem and what works best for you. Be aware, though, you're not trying to track everything that you're doing. You're not going to be able to set this all up as user stories and tick all the things off, because you're just going to end up spending all your time trying to track something that doesn't really track well within that system. All you're really doing here, and again, this is why the outreach is important, all you're really doing here is saying, there's this thing that I'm working on. It's taking a lot of my time, and I need to make sure you're aware of it. So it's sitting there in your system as an epic or something similar, so it gets looked at and approached as you go without the overhead and the burden of trying to actually track it as an Agile project. It's just there so people don't forget about you. Finally, keep talking to people. Your outreach to your team should never, ever stop. If you have a sprint review session at the end of every sprint where you get a chance to make presentations, make sure you do at least one in every phase, twice if it's a long phase or if you've got it getting a lot done. If you don't have an opportunity to give presentations at a sprint review meeting, grab any other opportunity you have to talk about what you're doing. It could be a lunchtime brown bag session, it could be grabbing a slot in a planning meeting, you could run a regular drop-in office hours session, something like that. And if all else fails, talk too long in stand-ups and eventually someone will find a way for you to talk about it. Trust me. So to conclude, I'm absolutely in favour of Agile development, and I will quite happily talk to anyone about Agile documentation for as long as they're willing to listen. But Agile documentation is not a one-size-fits-all solution, especially big projects like this for documentation. Don't be afraid to break out of the Agile mould if that's what your project requires. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Lana? And we have about 5 odd minutes left. Anyone want to argue with her for a while?
Go right ahead.
Oh, I'm not arguing, and I'm not even asking questions, but a quick statement. That was a great product development talk.
You're welcome.
It just happens to be a great documentation talk, but as the product person, yeah, that works.
Yep. I mean, look, docs is what I do, right? But I appreciate that there is product management, product development, software development. These are just different labels we put on the same thing, essentially. The actual work underneath may be different at the nuts and bolts level. Absolutely. Same process, different deliverable. I like that.
My question is related to the content of the documentation, particularly when you talk about making sure that you reach your audience. I can imagine that could create conflicts if the audience are extremely different, and one of those audiences are really, really technical, the other one is a little bit more not so technical, and they need like a larger review. Do you suggest separating then the documentation into two, or how do you manage that basically?
Again, it comes down to your audience analysis. If you've discovered that one of your main audiences needs something way more technical than one other, it may even be that they don't both need documentation. One might need videos. one might need wiki style, every page is page one, click on the things to drill down on more information. One might need a series of dot points to remind themselves of the different flags on that command. It really comes down to user analysis, task analysis, find the tool, find the mechanism that's the right thing for that audience. Sorry, I don't have an answer that requires less work.
Yes, I'm not a doc writer either, but I think this really does apply to software development. So there was one thing, going back to the planning phase, you kept talking about creating engagement, getting people to come back to you and associating you with the project. And kind of one issue that I've had is becoming a bottleneck, or kind of creating burnouts. That once you've pitched an idea and you're starting to build up a feature in people's heads, and they start to associate you with it, they start coming to you all the time about what to do about it, and you kind of,
it's the core
you get
maintainer
stuck
problem.
there. Yeah. So I was wondering if you have some ideas of how to avoid that.
The only thing I would say, having been that bottleneck on several projects, you know, it's funny how often I go to conferences and they go, "Oh, you're the Agile Docs lady," or "You're the whatever product that I'm currently working on lady." The only thing I would say is it's okay to say no. It's important to know who else has expertise. And also, I mean, it's probably just a general leadership / management thing as well, is appreciate that other people have skills that you don't. Sometimes when people come to you with a question, the best thing to do is, you know what, go see Jane, she's great at that. For starters, that helps with your outreach as well, because you're sharing information and you're bringing other people in, especially if they're younger or haven't got quite as much experience. You probably know as well as I do, when you've been hanging around in a particular community for a long time, you get known in that community and people tend to come to you more frequently. So sometimes being able to lift other people up is a really valuable thing. And then again, it comes down to, you're allowed to just say, actually, I've got far too much on my plate right now. How about you let someone else have a look at that? And if they have any trouble, they can get back to me and ask me some questions.
All right, I think we can further discussion as we exit, but I would like to thank Lana one more time for her talk.